you were the chief prosecutor of Hong Kong for over 10 years and have been living in the city for more than 4 decades. Can you tell us about the history of the national security issue in Hong Kong? Why has the central government proposed and passed the law now?
Well, of course, it is a very big issue, which goes back a long way. You will recall that when the future of Hong Kong was discussed between the Chinese side and the British side in the 1980s, that resulted in what's known as the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which was signed between Deng Xiaoping for China and Margaret Thatcher for the United Kingdom. And that covered the broad areas of agreement on the future of Hong Kong. But one of the areas that wasn't covered was national security. Some people suggest these days, when they condemn recent developments, that there's been a breach of what's in the Joint Declaration. But in fact, the Joint Declaration said nothing about national security, which was quite clearly a matter for China. And when the NPC in 1990 enacted the basic law of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, it took a very courageous and a very big decision, because in all parts of the world that I'm aware of, legislation for parts of the country are passed by the national parliament itself and aren't entrusted to local or regional assemblies to do. So that was a great show of faith in Hong Kong. But unfortunately, after 1997, the national security laws, which are provided for by Article 23 of the Basic Law, were not enacted. That, of course, meant that there was a gap in our legal apparatus in Hong Kong. As years went by, it became obvious that this was a concern, and a significant concern. Why do I say that? Well, it became apparent last year that people were prepared to use protests in order to launch violent attacks here in Hong Kong. And on top of that, of course, an independence or secessionist movement also emerged, which was prepared to use violence. Indeed, as you may remember, when the protesters smashed their way into the Legislative Council on the 1st of July of last year, one of the first things they did was to scrawl on the walls of the Legislative Council that Hong Kong is not China. They then damaged the regional emblem and destroyed copies of the Basic Law, the very symbols of one country, two systems. And ever since that time, they've made clear that many of them do have these secessionist views. They shout when they're indulging in their street protests and violence. They shout such things as liberation of our times, revolution now, Hong Kong independence the only way, and things like this. So it's quite clear that a separatist movement is operating within the broader protest movement itself. And this separatist movement is being encouraged by overseas forces. And a graphic illustration of that came last month on May the 19th, when in the United States Congress, when Congressman Perry, who's a member of the Republican Party, moved a motion in the House of Representatives calling upon authorizing the President of the United States, President Trump, to treat Hong Kong as a separate, independent nation. So it's obvious that this is obviously direct encouragement to the separatists in Hong Kong, and it reveals a plan by people in Washington, D.C. to try and divide up China. So against this background, it's quite clear that the present situation was intolerable. The local government had been unable, for various reasons, to enact the local national security law. The government in Beijing had really no option but to decide to enact the national security law itself.